There we
Hello.
go. Hey, Benjamin.
How's it going, Neil?
Look at you with your dark, gloomy, gothic background.
There's actually, you can't see them. I have to work on this, but there's actually Christmas lights there. It's supposed to
Okay,
be,
not quite so gloomy.
it's supposed to be the night sky, but it does look kind of bat cavey. How's your, well, I mean, you have the classic Zoom background,
That's right. That's steady.
popularized by the COVID-19 crisis.
And this is all real. It's not like a green screen. It's actually
No?
books.
Oh, individually
see it.
purchased?
Individually, yeah, I can hold some up there. There, I have my.
Oh, queer theory. Oh, wow.
I'm writing a
Okay.
chapter on queer theory right now for my new.
Writing or reading?
Well, I reread all of my queer theory books and read a new one. And then I'm writing a chapter on queer theory. So I'm in the
In
middle
support?
of not quite.
No.
No. I'm working on a book with Pat Sawyer. My next project is a book on critical social theories. So we're going to go through critical race theory, queer theory, and those are the two major ones. But then just like the overall framework, it'll be actually it's turning out to be similar to cynical theories. It's Jim and Helen's book, but it'll be for a Christian audience. So trying to understand, how should Christians look at these social theories and think about them? Anyway, are we starting? I'm being recorded, right? So
Well, you're going, so let's just go.
let's just go. Okay. Wait, erase all that. Erase all that. No, it's fine.
Is that project under wraps then? You don't want to?
Oh no, it's fine. No, I'm kidding.
Because I am curious about the relationship between progressivism and American Christianity.
Sure,
And
yeah,
by
we can talk about
progressivism, I mean like critical theory informed progressive social justice activism. Critical. You can put that in there somewhere if I didn't already. But yeah.
No one knows what to call it, right? So, like one of the things like the first section of our book currently, it's a draft form, but it's called "What's in a Name," and I talk about how everyone's tried to name this thing. People called it wokeness. Well, that's you're appropriating African American vernacular. Okay, we'll call it critical social justice. Well, no one uses that term. That's just D'Angelo's term. Okay, we'll call it critical race theory. Well, that's just a legal discipline. And so, Wesley Yang and people have been talking about this thing for 5-10 years. Wesley Yang calls it successor ideology. David French called it intersectionality a few years ago. We go through it's what's important is not the name, the label you use, it's the ideas behind it. And we talked about what are the core ideas, regardless of how you label them, and then why are those ideas ultimately corrosive to both society at large and the Christian faith in particular.
Okay, but it seems like they, on a rhetorical level, seem compatible to Christianity because it is about centering and lifting up the marginalized, right?
Well, that's the question. So I would say that more liberal, mainline sorts of Christians would say, yeah, Christianity is all about lifting up the marginal and liberating the oppressed. And what I would just say is that historically, while that's been one of the many applications of Christianity, so Christians have always been committed to acts of justice and mercy, have been committed to creating just societies. That's one of the applications of the Christian religion. It's only one, and so you can't equate Christianity with liberating the oppressed. There are Christian traditions, more modern ones that do that. Things like liberation theology, the social gospel tend to just equate the two. Christianity is all about just social reform. But traditionally, historically, Christianity's, when you look at the early creeds of the church, it's been about a message of Jesus' salvation for people who are under God's judgment, to be saved from sin. That's the core message you go back to. I'm talking about the 1800. I'm talking about go back to the 300 AD. Go back to the writings of the New Testament gospel authors themselves, and of course they did say care for the poor, love the widow and orphan. True religion, the Apostle James says, true religion is to care for the widow and orphan and to keep oneself unstained by the world. But that's just, again, that's one part, that's one aspect of Christian morality. And what's interesting is that if you elevate that aspect above the other aspects, and you also redefine words like justice and oppression, then you end up with a view of morality that actually conflicts with traditional Christian teaching. And so, in the book, we'll go through all of that and explain how modern critical theorists have redefined words like social justice, which was actually a term coined by a Catholic priest in the 19th century. But they've redefined that word. They've redefined the word justice. They've redefined the word oppression. They've redefined the word marginalization and power and all these different things. And in ways that Christians, that's why I think it's why these ideas have gotten such cachet among even evangelical Christians, because they're speaking in some sense in terms that we immediately gravitate towards. Christians are like, oh, of course I care about the marginalized. I care about the oppressed. Jesus himself was described as oppressed and afflicted. Right? A man of sorrows, familiar with suffering. And so we hear those words and we're like, oh yeah, I can get behind these ideas. And then add to that the fact that evangelicals, in the last, say, 50, 100 years have been behind, I think, the culture in terms of, properly understanding things like race and racism. I think we feel a lot of shame and say, yeah, you're right. We dropped the ball in a major way in terms of dealing with Jim Crow and discrimination. And so then to catch up, we're like, yeah, we'll totally onboard all these ideas. And I'm thinking, whoa, slow down. The pendulum can swing the too far the other direction. Anyway, so we'll talk about all that stuff. We can talk about it now if you want to. This is your channel, Rand. You just tell me what you want to.
Fascinated by it, and it also dovetails with what we're nominally here to speak about, which is your book, Why Believe. So I think it's all of a piece, right? Because you can't have the theory without the practice.
Yeah.
Or the praxis, as the theorists would say. Are you one pervasive, and it's kind of crusty now, John McWhorter's book came out almost a year ago, I think, about woke religion or something like that, but it's been a metaphor since I got into this conversation about talking about the religious aspects of social justice ideology. When I was exposed to it at the Evergreen State College, it had very explicit and very cringy religious overtones, like where they tried to start doing worship services, but they were kind of worshiping black bodies. It was really weird, but I saw, and my first statement of it was to the effect that it's like a broken religion, or it takes some parts of Christianity and it leaves other parts, but it's kind of very Christian. It's puritanical, it's evangelical. There's something in its DNA, maybe rhetorical or cultural, that is very Christian. Do you guys explore that and how it's kind of a descendant of or a mutation of older Christian movements, or like something particularly American?
Yeah, I'm actually looking up. So Pat, my collaborator, Dr. Pat Sawyer, and I have written a number of articles. And one of them was published last year, I think, for the American Conservative. I'm pulling it up right now so I can actually quote from it. Because the title was something like, in the face of social justice, the gospel's still good news. And we actually, in that piece, we talk about, the title is, if you want to look it up, the American Conservative published it. It's called Facing Woke Religion, the Gospel is Still Good News. And in that article, we talk about how one way to think about, again, wokeness or critical social justice, whatever you want to call these ideas. Again, we focus on the ideas, and we outline what they are. But one of the ways to think about it is that it is an alternate view of our fundamental problem as human beings, which Christianity would say is sin. Like we have violated God's moral law. We have all failed to live like we ought to live. But critical social justice would say actually the real problem that we all face fundamentally is oppression of various kinds. And they define that as ruling groups, ruling classes, whether it's whites, men, heterosexuals, the physically abled, Christians. The problem is ruling classes have imposed their values on us, and that is oppression. They've imposed the gender binary. They've imposed heteronormativity. They've imposed white supremacy. They impose their values on us, and it's taken for granted as natural and normal. And so all of us, to the degree that we are minoritized, whether we're people of color or we're women or we're LGBTQ people, we've all been oppressed through those narratives about the gender binary or about white supremacy, or about masculinity. And anyway, so that's the problem. And then for Christianity, there's a solution to the problem. And Christianity says, well, the solution is redemption. You can't fix yourself. None of us can. We can try really hard to live a good life and to be good people, and maybe we should, but ultimately it's not enough, because in trying to fix yourself, it's like, when you're covered in mud, like you can kind of like try to wipe your hands off, but just get more and more muddy, right? You just spread the mud. And so the point is, Christianity has always been a religion that says we need someone to come from outside to rescue us. Well, within critical social justice, the solution, if the problem is oppression, the solution is activism. You can either, if you're a privileged person, or to the degree that you are, you want to divest yourself of your privilege. You want to stand in solidarity with oppressed people. And if you're an oppressed person, then you want to work to dismantle these hegemonic systems and structures that are producing the social binary of oppressors and oppressed. And then the ultimate goal for Christians is, again, a new creation, that one day Jesus will return to renew all things, to make things right, to administer justice, and that's the end utopia, the end, the coming of Christ. That's the goal. But critical theory offers an alternate goal, which is equity. You're going to reach this utopia where there's no more hegemonic power, no more oppression. We're all living in a state of power sharing and diversity and social justice and inclusion. But the point is, when you frame it that way, it's offering you a different meta-narrative, different overarching story of reality. And I love quoting, I have it behind me somewhere, but Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, in their book Cynical Theories, which I really enjoy, they actually have a great paragraph. I love quoting it, but it talks about how we now have sort of a gospel of social justice, and people treat these texts like they're scripture. And then they go through all of these ideas like all white people are racist, all men are sexist, and we all need to decolonize. Our minds are colonized by whiteness. We have to be freed from this, the hegemonic power of these narratives. And then they say, does this sound like a meta-narrative? That's because it is. And I'm like, I totally agree. We have two alternate ways of understanding reality, a Christian one and a critical social justice one. And they really are functioning like religion. And then the last thing I'll say is just that in the same article, we talk about that. Well, why is it so compelling? Because you look at people that are super woke, and you've seen it. You saw it at Evergreen, right? It's cringy. It's a little scary. It's like I'm sure that Christians can sound scary and cult-like to non-Christians. I get that, but in the same way, the sort of radical left sounds cult-like and scary to, say, liberals. And so we ask, well, how do you get sucked into that? How do you not just see this is like a cult? And the answer is that Christians say, ultimately, all of us, whether you're religious or not religious, you're seeking what's called justification, which for Christianity means a declaration that you're okay, you're righteous, you're on the right side, you've been forgiven, you're good. So all of us are seeking that.
Okay.
And the natural human heart says, how do you get justified? How do you feel like you're okay, you're a good person, you're righteous? And you do it. All of us do it different ways, but one of the ways you can do it by living according to traditional morality. I'm going to go to church and be a good person. I'm going to get religious. You can do it by, working for be a philanthropist. What's that?
Good deeds.
Good deeds. Yeah, you can do good works and you can feel justified. I know I'm righteous. I know I'm good, because you can do it by demonizing other people. Well, I'm not like those people. I mean, Jesus tells a parable about this, how the tax collector looks down on those the Pharisee looks down on that nasty tax collector. I'm so good, you're so awful. But we're saying that critical social justice does that by saying you can cleanse yourself. If you can confess your privilege, you can flagellate yourself. You can say, I repent of my whiteness. I repent of my masculinity. You can sit inside. And all of those acts of penitence, we point out, those are the same, you say, why do people do that? It's the same underlying human desires that led, medieval peasants to wear hair shirts and to flagellate themselves. Mm-hmm. And it's ingrained. We're not disparaging it. We're saying, yeah, that's completely normal. Why? Because I have that too. I desire to feel good and righteous. The difference is that Christianity, I think, and this is, I could even cite religious scholars saying, it's unique in that it says you can't do that for yourself. You can't wipe out that damned spot. You can't do it. You need to just throw yourself on the mercy of God. And so, but the point is, because we're all seeking that, deep in our hearts, there's this void, this need to feel righteous. And if you don't fill it with say trusting in Jesus to say I can be clean not because I am clean, but because He's forgiven me. You can't do that. You're going to find it somewhere else, whether it's working really hard, being really woke, being really conservative. I don't know. There's different ways to feel good about yourself. But we're all trying to fill that need. And so this is just but it's a very popular way to do that.
Yeah. There's been some discourse recently, and I haven't actually mapped where it came from, but it sounds like a cynical tool to maintain a certain power structure. But there's this fear-mongering or worry-warting over Christian nationalism, as if Christian nationalism is a unified fascistic threat, which is one problem I have with it, because if you start to do any research into Christianity, you see that there's a bunch of people who disagree with each other. It's not like one fascist organization.
Right, yeah.
But secondly, it's kind of odd that that is being used to stir up people's anxiety when this woke stuff has kind of become the state religion in and of itself. And I wonder if wokeness, because it's modern or there's something that's not religious in its wording, that it is more adaptable to a so-called secular state.
I would say it's not overtly. It still uses secular language, even though I would argue that, like you said, the symbols and the emotions it evokes are very religious, right? Yeah. But it's still framed in terms of sociology and science and social science, and you're not talking about angels and demons. You're talking about system of privilege.
It's academitized somehow.
That's right. Yeah. So they've managed to secularize, this very Manichaean, like this very good and evil, right and wrong, angels and demons, but they've managed to secularize all that. It's actually an interesting parallel. If you've ever read C.S. Lewis's book, That Hideous Strength, you should read it if you haven't read it. It's basically, he was a Christian Oxford professor. He wrote a trilogy, but the last book called That Hideous Strength. And he talks about how these scientists have managed to cloak essentially this religion in scientific beliefs, and they're selling it to the public. Anyway, it's very prescient. But I do think that the Christian nationalism, actually I've read several books on it, many of them written by professing Christians, about the danger of the Christian nationalist right. Okay. I do think that there are, based on surveys, there are professing Christians who have, I think, just obviously wrong ideas about the role of the United States, and maybe even one thing that really stands out is something like 2/3 of professing Christians believe that the Constitution is divinely inspired. Oh. And if you know about Christian theology, it's like a big no-no. The Bible, and in all of history, the Bible is God's unique revelation to all Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox would say, no, the Bible is unique in that way. So American Christians, a large fraction of them would I don't know, what do they mean by that? I don't know. Yeah. Maybe they just mean it's really a good document. I hope, but that's a troubling statistic.
Why is it troubling though? Isn't that kind of good? In a way, is that not a good fascia to connect a country to have such a stance towards that founding document? No. Right.
So from a secular perspective, ironically, you could just say, well, they really admire and revere their founding documents, which are frankly pretty good, right? I think the difference as a Christian, I would say, but we don't hold the Bible as pretty good. It's a different category. Okay. It'd be like here's an analogy. If I were like, I worship God as a Christian, you're like, yeah, obviously. If I were like, I worship my wife, you're like, isn't that healthy? And no, not in a Christian sense. You would not want to say you worship your wife. You would love your wife. You would sacrifice anything for her, but you wouldn't worship her. That would be, you're mixing religious categories here. So in the same way, I think that way inappropriate reverence for the Constitution, which is it's a good document. I like the Constitution. But I'm not gonna treat it like it's on par with what God has said.
Okay.
And also the thing is, we've amended the Constitution. We've changed it from recognizing, well, needs to get fixed. And also, I think that attitude can blind us to legitimate problems the nation has had. We're not a perfect nation, and I think to playing the devil's advocate, I'm steel manning this argument from the progressives. you can worry that if you really imbibe this idea that America's God's chosen nation, we're the redeemed people of it, which is, again, biblically not true. But if you embrace that idea, then basically it's like the U.S. can do no wrong. And the U.S. has done plenty of wrong, like every nation. We're just one nation among many, and so we have to have the humility to say this nation's not perfect. We're not God's chosen nation, and so we have to be able to say, yeah, this is actually evil what we did and what we're doing right now. But that said, if you look at scholarship and these popular works written by scholars like Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry or Robert Jones, he wrote. What did he write? He wrote Taking America Back for God. Robert Jones wrote something like, was it White Too Long, I think? They've all written, Anthea Butler wrote White Evangelical Racism. I've read a number of these books that are critiquing Christian national or white Christian nationalism. What does concern me is that they're clearly, I'm granting them there is this unhealthy conflation of America and God. Like, or American Christianity, like to be American is to be Christian, to be Christian is to be American. Again, which globally is not true. I think that there are more Christians living in Africa than there are in the whole U.S. Or way more than that. But it's like there's more than that. It's crazy. Like there are more Presbyterians living in, I think, Ghana than in Scotland, which is sort of like the heartland of Presbyterian. The point is, we have global Christianity is way bigger than the U.S. So to conflate the two is very obviously very just wrong. Historically and factually, but so I'm granting that there's a real thing there, it's a phenomenon. But the problem is when they try to measure it, like Whitehead and Perry's book will ask questions like, should the government support Christian values? And now that's a very ambiguous question because, well, what are some Christian values? Caring for the poor, not murdering your neighbor, private property, not stealing. So. Yeah, and the government everybody thinks the government should support those Christian values. I've never talked to like a secular person who's like, yeah, totally murder is a Judeo-Christian norm. We should get rid of that murder thing. The point is that when they try to when I try to gauge how many people out there are Christian nationalists, they'll often use these really ambiguous questions that have all these false positives. So the problem becomes, there is a problem, but it becomes far bigger and overblown compared to what it actually is in my personal life. Like I have met impersonal people that I actually know. I have met zero people that could even be remotely considered Christian nationalists who have any sense that they would. Actually, the evangelicals I know are some of the most emphatic that they do not want a state church, or they don't, because the two are different. It's part of actually evangelical distinctives is that and I'm an evangelical, but we take very seriously the idea that that Christianity is something that is primarily internal. You can't make someone a Christian by just calling them a Christian or doing things to them and having certain laws. Their hearts has to change. And so we want to maintain a very clear distinction between, I grew up in a Christian nation, therefore I'm a Christian, or I grew up in America, therefore I'm a Christian. And that, frankly, actually, before I was actually a Christian, I thought of myself that way. I said, I believe in God. I live in the U.S. I must be a Christian. Jesus seems pretty cool to me. I must be a Christian. And when I realized, no, it's actually, to be a Christian means something about how you relate to Jesus. That's kind of important. So in general, the evangelicals I know are emphatic that no. We don't want to impose not values, which I think should be imposed by government, like don't murder. But we don't want to say everyone has to professedly be a Christian in order to be a citizen, because that would actually create a lot of hypocrisy. We don't really want that. Jesus was very opposed to that kind of hypocrisy. Anyway, so I just think it is overblown as a threat. And like you said, in terms of what I see being validated by the state, it's not Christian nationalism. It is wokeness. The woke have all of the institutional power in this country right now. The woke are the ones teaching the schools and in the government, in the military. So, and I always, or like example I use, this is a silly one. Libs of TikTok shows these insane videos of teachers just outright saying, I'm here to teach my preschool class about sexuality and the Black Lives Matter movement and all this just super woke stuff. And they're volunteering that information. Like, this is my curriculum for this year. And I just have to ask, where is the like conservatives of TikTok? Where's the parallel? If the main problem in the U.S. right now, the threat is Christian nationalism. Okay, well, where are the conservatives or the racists being like, my curriculum this year is I'm going to teach the kids about Hitler and I'm going to teach them about how slavery was awesome. But there's none of that. And if you were to see that, that guy would be fired like in a snap. I'm assuming there have been cases where they've caught, actual neo-Nazis and they're fired. The school apologizes. So I'm not. Maybe they're out there. I don't know if there's a conservative TikTok Twitter handle, but I just find that in my day-to-day life, living in North Carolina, there's not a symmetry there. I don't walk into a public school and think, I bet you they're teaching kids, neo-Nazism. I do walk in there and say, I wonder if they're teaching kids about gender ideology.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In the closing chapter of Cynical Theories by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, and I've spoken with them both quite regularly, so it's not a diss on them, but they propose a liberal solution, or they propose what they perceive of as a middle way based on liberal values of, I guess, liberty and open argument and debate. And if that is the center, and on the progressive left, you have this evangelical, fundamentalist faith that's based on very intense theories that you detailed about oppression and disrupting and dismantling hierarchies while gaining more power at the same time. And then on the right, or the far right, to whatever degree, there's a Christian fundamentalism that expects Americans to be Christian and American values to be Christian. And I'm looking at a lot of the arguments on the right, and they make sense up to a certain point. And that point where I have to back away is imposition. Mm-hmm. And I like what you were saying about evangelicals not wanting to impose Christianity, because that is a contradiction and it doesn't actually work that way. But in the apologetics of Christianity, there's still very strong claims about being the end-all be-all of religion, right? So there is very strong claims that you detail and you argue, and there's a long tradition of arguing for Christianity as the way, the truth, and the life, capital T, on all those thes. So it could be construed or misconstrued as not fascistic, that's an overused term, but imposing values.
Coercing,
coercive.
Coercion,
the problem with liberalism, the problem with the middle way is that it's always going to be open to some sort of coercive force, whether it's repressive tolerance or religious intolerance.
Right.
How does Christianity fit within a liberal world order? And by that, I mean more than one religion can work together, more one interpretation can work together.
Sure. So what I would say is, one of the criticisms I have actually of, I really like Cynical Theories as a book, but I did a review of it for an evangelical web or journal. And one of the critiques I had was that they proposed this alternative liberal vision of, social order. And I point out that, and in their own words, their accounting of liberalism, it's a methodology. It's how you resolve conflict.
Conflicts, yeah.
Via reason, via evidence, via compromise. That's basically what liberalism is a set of rules for how you resolve conflicts. And one of my arguments was that can't beat wokeness. And why? Because wokeness is a narrative. It's a story. Yeah. And stories are always more interesting than like a phone book.
I think interesting is an dreadful underestimation of the power of stories and the necessity of stories.
Exactly. And so you're trying to fight a really, a story has good and evil and a hero and a villain and the right side and the wrong side and this clash of, and critical theory is a story. It's a meta-narrative. I agree with them, but you're trying to fight it by offering procedural liberalism, which is basically a set of tools. It's like you're trying to fight a really bad pulp fiction novel, as bad as it is, but it's full of gore and violence, and it's you can't put it down. You're trying to fight that with a phone book, a list of rules, like Robert's Rules of Order for like motions and seconding and committees. It's not. And I'm like, it's not just. I wish it would work. It's not going to work. The way to oppose a story is with a better story, and I'm a Christian, a true story. And so I'm saying Christianity offers a a better narrative that still has not compelling in the coercion sense, but it tugs at our hearts, not just our brain. It does both, I argue. And so I do say that I think I want to be careful here because there's a spectrum. Obviously, evangelicals, Christians are a broad tradition, have a lot of different views of governmental role.
Are you consider yourself evangelical then?
Yeah, I mean, to be frank, historically, I'd be considered a fundamentalist, not in the modern sense, which basically just means a stupid person. If you look at what the original fundamentalists said, they're like, you just got to believe what Christians have believed since like the dawn of Christianity. And so I'd affirm things like basically my theology is very similar to what you'd find in like Martin Luther, John Calvin, the Reformers, going back hundreds, even thousands of years, St. Augustine. Okay. And I'd say today, if you believe those things, you'd be called a fundamentalist. And I don't mind the term. I'm like, look, I
use that as derogatory.
Yeah, right, I get it.
But my dad always says you can't say that because what does that mean? Like you believe in the Bible, that's all that it means.
That's right. Yeah, but there's a funny article by a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga, who's a famous evangelical philosopher, who says basically, can I say this on your channel? But it's in his paper. He says that calling someone a fundamentalist is like calling him a sumbitch. Like it's a pejorative. It doesn't mean anything. It's just like I don't like that person.
Yeah.
So that was a philosophy paper. I'm quoting a real paper. But anyway, so there's a spectrum of views on how Christians should relate to government. To what extent should Christianity be promoted, tolerated, apart from the government?
Force, yeah.
Yeah, but I think what evangelicals, for the most part, in the U.S. today, and I would argue, at least in the last, say, 200 years in the U.S., would generally say is that that the public square is not neutral, and we're seeing that today. Public square can't be neutral. It's got to have values. You can't have no values in the public square. You're gonna value certain things like liberty, freedom, free expression, free speech. You have values, and frankly, if you go to like countries in say the Arab world, they don't have those values. Free speech. You can't blaspheme Muhammad. So the point is, you have to decide which values are we going to enforce as a society, as a government. And there's debates on. So you say, well, we're gonna don't keep Christian values out of the government. Well, again, you can't. You got to keep. You have some values. There will be values that Christians agree with or don't agree with. What I would say is that, broadly speaking, evangelicals in the last, say, 100 years have tried to limit, say, in the public square, to have some sort of somewhat minimal set of shared values. So, and that's why I think Christianity is compatible with sort of a liberalish approach to things like free speech, free expression, freedom of conscience. So you'll see, I've heard evangelicals who work for organizations that are committed to religious freedom, and they really mean that. They mean we want religious freedom for Muslims, for Jews, for Christians, for Buddhists, for Hindus, for atheists. We want all groups, and because we want truly to have a free public square, because we believe that Christianity can compete and can say this is why Christianity is true and can convince people through reason, not through, if you don't do this, we're going to put you in jail.
Okay.
So again, there's a spectrum, but I think broadly speaking, if you look at how the average evangelical thinks about these issues, and I could be wrong, but major outlets, you will see Christians, saying we do not want Christianity to be the state religion because we don't want to make you be a Christian because it'll help your career, because that'll make you a hypocrite. Okay. We want you to believe because you actually believe. And
even though that's virtuous on one end, it could be the case that the minimalization by Christians in the public sphere and the softening and the retreat of certain hardline forms of rhetoric laid the groundwork for liberalism to be completely taken over by another religion.
And I agree. Yeah, and that's
why
from
the dissonant right kind of point of view. Yeah,
it's exactly right. I was going to say there's I think more and more there are Christians who are there. Again, the ones that I know at least, they're not like, let's just have a new crusade. they're asking, look, it's great to say we're going to have this minimalistic framework of like public goods and free speech and free expression. That's great, I guess, but like, what do you do when wokeness comes and says we're going to have no more genders? and what do you do when half the populace has been, ideologically co-opted and thinks there are 100 genders now, and their idea of the public good is, have 100 genders on all your forms. And so at what point do you say, look, we can't just say, well, we can't coerce anyone. We got to say, no, this is reality. There are two genders, and and there are obviously things like intersex that are biological conditions, but you can't just create new genders every day. And there's basically, I think, what they're the sort of call it. What do you call it? It was a good phrase, like the not the new right, the dissident right. Yeah. Dissident right. Okay, the dissident right saying, look, you're still operating as if there is this consensus. We're operating from this Judeo-Christian hangover. Where we're like, oh, come on, everybody knows that there are two genders. Well, that might have worked 20, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. It's not working today. We can't appeal to common sense anymore. And so they are asking, well, maybe we do have to have some like firm, no, you can't do this. It's just not inclined with reality. And again, but I think that still, if I had to take a thermometer measurement of like the atmosphere of evangelicalism, that's still a very small minority. That average evangelical just wants more or less like traditional liberalism. Either whether they admit it's naive. I don't know whether it's naive or not. I'm just saying that the average evangelical is not saying like let's just throw all the atheists in jail. I don't think I've ever heard that from anybody. Even the most crazy out there far right people. Yeah.
The problem or a weakness of Christianity when you put it up against wokeness and liberalism, or liberalism as a protocol of fixing disagreements or coming to some sort of consensus, is this little thing called pride. There's something Luciferian, both about liberalism and about its ultra spawn progressivism. Progressivism, wokeness, whatever, centers the human will. It centers the human enacting justice. It's almost Gnostic, where I can believe myself into, or I can think the world into a better state of being, or by these different processes. Liberalism's kind of lightly Luciferian insofar as it puts faith in humans' rationality. It supposes that human beings are these rational, independent, atomized subjects that will eventually make the right decision given enough time to reason through things, which I think is still, it's a better God than this oppression dynamic, but it's still based on pride. Christianity's message is that, and Christians are not exempt from being prideful.
Oh yeah, of course not.
Right, and they have pride in certain ways, but the central story mechanic, or one of the mechanics in Christianity, is that you have to actually give that up. You have to surrender. You have to surrender your will to God, and that is, I can see that that's kind of a weakness when you go up against wokeness. What do you have to say about that?
So, I will concede that. And here's the reason. Again, I'm speaking from a Christian perspective, so you're like, well, that doesn't make sense. But what I would argue is that and this has been debated by Christian theologians for a long time, but I think it's fair to say that the fundamental human problem is pride. If you look at this narrative of the Bible, Genesis 1 through 3, the original sin in the Garden of Eden, the fall, the temptation was you'll be your own gods. You can call the shots. You get to be the center of your universe. You create the universe. God's the center, but no. You take control. You be the center of the universe. You decide what's good and evil for yourself. And that first sin is the essential sin that ever since then, we center the universe on us, my feelings, my desires, my wants, my rationality, whatever it is. You're the center of your life, the universe, and everything. And so you say, well, Christianity says you have to give all that up. And I totally agree. Christianity is like basically turning the world right, not upside down, but right side up, and saying, no, wait, this is crazy. I'm talking about the creator of the entire universe, who literally counts the hairs on my head, who loves me more than anybody else in the world. And I'm going to tell him that I'm in charge. No, it totally reverses that and says, no, actually, God's in charge now. But the problem is, you're right, that's the main obstacle in the human heart to belief in that kind of God. We don't want that. It threatens us. And so that will always be unappealing to the natural human heart. But what I would say is two things. One is this. One is that the gospel, the message of Christianity, is not that you need to, you just got to grit your teeth and clench your knuckle, white knuckle, and just give it up, give it all to God. You can do it. Come on. Because here's the irony. let's say you manage to do that. You're like, yeah, that makes sense rationally. I'm totally going to just surrender everything to God. And you do it, and you look around, you're like, now you slobs, you guys need to do it too. I managed to do it. I gave everything up. What did you just do? You're proud. You're proud again. I'm the best. I'm so good. So you reify, you reenact the very original sin, even in your attempts at getting right with God.
Yeah.
So the funny thing is that paradox is there where Christians have always seen this, that it's not a matter of you doing something. Because you try to give up your pride. That's just a thing that you're going to boast in. I broke my pride. You can do it too. So then the second point is that Christianity has always said you can't do it yourself. Someone has to come rescue you. And the way Christianity works, again, it's this weird, it's not weird. It's that we were lost. We're like, the metaphor the Bible uses lost sheep. And sheep, if you actually know this, it's not a compliment. Sheep are smelly. They're stupid. They're helpless. Like you actually talk to like shepherds, or they're like, they get stuck in brambles. They get eaten by wolves. They're just dumb. So the point is, we're like sheep. We've gone astray. And then God comes in and says, you can't do it yourself. Yeah. I'll send my son Jesus to live the life you should have lived, to die on the cross for you, to rescue you. And then I can offer all of it to you as a gift. Now, how does that kill your pride? What's the one thing you can't be proud about? A gift you didn't deserve. Okay. Like, no one's proud of like someone just if you were to murder someone's child, and then they forgave you, would you be like, look at that, they forgave me? You'd be like, what did you just forgave me? You'd be crying tears of joy. I can't believe this. Well, that's the amazing grace that Christianity talks about. And so it kills your pride by taking your eyes off yourself. Take your eyes off yourself and look what God's done for you. You don't even have to try to not be, I'm not going to be proud anymore. You're like, I can't even imagine what God did for me. And so now I just out of me flows this humility. Well, I didn't do anything. I just got saved. And so I think that, and this is where I a lot of conservatives want to kind of fight fire with fire. I get that. You see these ideas that are so toxic and so bad. And you're like, how can we fight fire with fire? And I'm not primarily motivated by politics, so I got to stay out of the culture, that political stuff. But I'm saying spiritually, there's a battle too. I think the answer to wokeness, which it really does, like all human philosophy, is trades on pride. The answer is the gospel. You break the pride of man by pointing to the grace of God and saying, this is why you can't be proud. You have nothing to be proud of. You're a miserable sinner and you've been forgiven. So get out of your own head and look upwards. Anyway, that's my little spiel for, I think. So I actually couldn't concede. As a political platform, Christianity it's not going to be appealing. But my point is, well, I think it's true though. So,
Yeah. Well, in aggregate, if you take the dynamics, the manifest dynamics by which not just what's preached within that which we call wokeness, but what is actually animating it and the emotions and what I just pointed to, which is pride and self. There was this, to get slightly political, but not too political, there was this comic, this web comic that's been circulating on the internet for the last 4 or 5 days.
The life one.
Yeah, this like Mom's Life, and it's a bunch of snarky takedowns of her husband. Yeah. And the one that went viral was about this peach, where she saw this peach on the counter and she's like, oh, I want to save this for the kids. And the husband saw the peach and said, oh, well, I want that for me. I'm going to put that in my smoothie. And then it turns out that her husband pays all the bills, works 2 jobs, does all the dinner, does all the shopping so that she can work on her comic and teach yoga. So it's fascinating, but I didn't want to diss on it, or I find 1 or 2 puns and I leave a current thing alone. Sure. But I went over to Instagram, I went over to the account, and she had this this non-apology, which we see a lot in Twitter, especially on the progressive end of Twitter. It's like, oh, look at all these people that are trolling me and coming after all these misogynists, all these racists, or whatever it is, and I'm being persecuted. Mm-hmm. So she asked her audience, how did my comics help you? Mm-hmm. Let's heap praise upon one another. And I was just reading just the language. It was all I and me and being seen, and it was really, really narcissistic. So I bring that up to say that in aggregate, what this ideology, and that's not necessarily wokeness, but it's kind of a part of our current cultural milieu. That's what's centered. That's what gets the clicks. And there might be some sort of algorithmic influence there, which I think is another kind of Luciferian thing. In aggregate, I don't think that leads to people being happy. I don't think that leads to people being good to one another. I think it leads to people adulating themselves and adulating their own pain and magnifying and worshiping their downtroddenness or their empowerment. And what you see in Christianity is you still have the same people within Christianity. There is this thing called the church lady that was in Christianity that Dana Carvey made famous. Right, and we all kind of know that trope or that archetype was released from the church and and she dyed her hair purple and is now on street corners telling everybody what to do. There's something about Christianity that kind of contained that. I'm just thinking this, I might not be right about this, but it seemed like Christianity contained that and constantly exposed that archetype. And there's a lot of other archetypes that are masculine that need to be contained and constantly exposed to grace and gratitude, grace and gratitude, grace and gratitude,
right.
grace and gratitude. So on a cultural level, there's virtues with Christianity properly construed that actually solve some of the problems that wokeness releases on the world and lets run rampant.
That's a good way to think about it. So, because I agree that, and I would totally agree. In ourselves, we all have the tendency to, again, what are we doing? We're exalting ourselves. I can tell you what to do because I'm above you. I'm the virtuous person, and I'm the best. The world centers on me, and let me explain to you, benighted masses, how you ought to be living and what's wrong and why you're problematic and how you need to decenter yourself and do the work and be better. There's always been that part of, I think it's in everything. It's in every religion. Because it's in our hearts. It's not escapable. But like you said, Christianity is a constant reminder. You can't think that way anymore. In fact, it's not even rational to think that way because, and I just reading 1 Corinthians to my kids, Paul writes, what do you have that you didn't receive? Everything you've been given is a gift. You didn't work for it. You didn't strive for it. You didn't earn it. You earned the opposite. And yet you've been given this gift. And so, again, ideally within Christianity, if you're reading the Bible and hearing good preaching, you're being reminded every single week, every single day in the Bible, this is not from you. This is not about you. And so hopefully that will constantly remind us, I cannot exalt myself. This is another theme in the Bible. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who humble themselves will be exalted. So you want to go up, you want to rise to the top, lower yourself.
Well, see, again, that's just anti-political because whoever exalts themselves gets rewarded over and over and over again. They're the big names. They're the check marks. They're the ones who, even Donald Trump, love him or hate him, completely exalted and took advantage of the egotistical nature of kayfabe politics. And, in a way, he kind of broke the illusion that everybody involved in politics wasn't that way. But that's the winner.
Right, and I think I do. Well, that's why I was saying, and maybe this gives you an insight into how evangelicals think, right? Because I'm right here saying I'm not trying to win the politics game, and maybe you're like, well, it's not going to work. Well, okay, that's fine. I'm not trying to. How can we create an awesome, successful political party? I'm saying I think Christianity is true, and it operates on the human heart primarily. And so, of course, that'll have implications for our politics. But I've always been about here's how we can get enough votes to sweep the elections in 2022. I'm just saying this is how we should respond to reality. So yeah, I would. And I think most evangelicals I've talked to, that's their gut instinct is to think in terms of the human heart, and then later down the road, how will that influence politics? So I think I'm just like a cage in a zoo. You can look at the evangelical, look how he's thinking about reality.
And so you wrote a book, Why Believe, and it's an apologetic. What would you call it? What would be the genre? It's Christian apologetics, but
Christian apologetics. So yeah, that's the genre on Amazon. It's like number 5.
It says apologetics right there. But what kind of flavor do you think, or where does it fit in relation to other works of this nature?
Oh, so in the genre, I wrote this. So apologetics, for those who don't know, apologetics in Christianity is the reasoned defense of the truth of Christianity. So you're defending Christianity as a reasonable faith through reason and evidence. And it goes back, again, 2,000 years. Justin Martyr was kind of the first apologist in the 2nd century, I think. So that's it. And then what does my book do that sort of stands out? There are a lot of great books out there. Tim Keller wrote a very popular book called The Reason for God. It was a New York Times bestseller years ago.
You do mention that.
And actually, so I liked his book so much that when I was working at Yale as a postdoc, and I bought a box of them. I don't forget how many, like 50, 100 of these books. And I used to give them out at the Yale, the student dining hall for the freshmen. I give them out. But after a while, I was like, I can't afford this. It's getting too expensive. And the reason I was doing it, though, is because I actually became a Christian in part because I went to undergraduate at Princeton. And my freshman year, I was spiritual but not religious. And my freshman year, the same campus group as Crew were handing out free books in front of my dining hall. And I'm not a Christian, but they have the Bible. I'm like, I don't want the Bible. But they have 2 books by C.S. Lewis. So they had the guy who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. They had his book Mere Christianity, and they had his book The Screwtape Letters. And so I left the Bible. It's like, I don't want that stuff. And I grabbed these 2 other books, and I took them back to my room, and they never saw me again. I was like, this is great, free books. But I loved those books. I loved The Screwtape Letters. It's so good. And so I know that God can use, that's a very subtle, God was pretty sneaky. There's a subtlety there. It's like this little thing that I thought was it's a free book, but it ended up, I read that book like 20 times before becoming a Christian. Because of his insight.
What was it about it that was tickling you? Or
you got to read it. So if you read Screwtape Letters?
A long time ago.
It's so good. So I was just rereading it actually just yesterday. It's a series of, I shouldn't spoil it. Okay, it's a little spoiler. It's pretty obvious. It's a series of letters written by a senior demon in hell to his incompetent protege on earth, who's in charge of tempting a human patient. So it's instructions from a demon on how to another demon on how to successfully tempt a human. But it's just full. And so I read it as a non-Christian. And I read it so much because I was like, how does he know what's going on in my head? I don't mean like voices. I just mean like it is all fiction, but he's illustrating like the issues of pride, this posing, this self-righteousness, this insincerity. He casts it in this fictional framework. But I was like, this is incredibly insightful. And I was like, how does this random guy who's a literature professor at Oxford, he wrote 70 years ago, how does he have such insight into my life? And in retrospect, it's because he understands human nature. And so I love this. Anyway, so then from that, I became a Christian in grad school. I was giving out these copies of Reason for God at Yale, and I said, this is expensive. And so I was like, I got to start writing up my own book, and I'll give it away for free. And then I moved to North Carolina to do more research at Duke, and again, my church friends were saying, you should write your own book. And so I wrote it, finished it about 5 years ago, and then took years to I was lazy, frankly. I was like, it's done, I'm done. My wife was like, you got to publish this thing, it's done. I was like, yeah, I'll get to it later. Finally, my friend Pat Sawyer, he's like, this is a good book, you got to, I'll take care of it. I'll be your liaison. And so he actually contacted Christian publishers, and so we,
cool.
So he was really the motive force behind this book getting out there. That's a story of where it came from.
So in your conversion story that you just kind of glossed in relation to the Screwtape Letters, it sounds like what you were wrestling with was the same thing that many people at that age, 22, 23, 24, are wrestling with, which is authenticity and fakeness. And it seemed from your brief account and the account that you write in the book that you were responding to wanting to be real in some way. And seeing things about yourself, your pride, your self-righteousness, tricking you from seeing your true state, your authentic self. And it's just, I bring that up because I just see slight parallel in what's happening with social media and how it's promising or promoting this authentic self that is fakery upon fakery upon fakery upon fakery. And that really ensnares a lot of young people. So I'm just wondering, insofar as that is a correct interpretation of your story, Is that something that Christianity has solved for you?
So I don't think I was searching for my authentic self. I think, and I'm not saying it's a wrong or bad thing. Actually, it's a great, if you want to read a book on that, the history of that search for identity, it's a great new book that came out. It's the author went on Ben Shapiro's show. It's a very popular book, but the author is an evangelical Christian named Carl Trueman. The book is called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. He's a historian. And the book it's not written from a Christian perspective. It's written just as a historian about where we got the idea. So actually, he looks at transgender and says, how do we come as a culture to a place where the sentence, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, that makes sense to us, but how? Like, what are the assumptions that are natural to us that allow us to parse that sentence? Because 100 years ago, 200 years ago, you couldn't even have made sense of that sentence. It would have been like saying, like, I'm a pickle. You're like, you're what? I'm a square circle. You're like, what do you even mean? Well, but we can understand the sentence, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, because of certain assumptions that are baked into the way we view reality. So he goes through the history, going back to like the Romantic period, and I think Nietzsche and various philosophers like Marcuse, and says this is how we got here. Anyway, it's a really good book, but he talks about how the search for the authentic self is a major cultural thing. For whatever reason, 20 years ago, that was not my major search. I was who I was. I was happy with who I was. I wasn't searching for meaning or anything else. But I think what spoke to me about Lewis's book and about the Christian gospel, and I understood it, was the question of how do I know I'm good? Like, how do I know? So I know who I am. I'm happy with who I am. And up to until when I was not a Christian, I would have said, and I'm a good person. I know who I am. And not just I'm happy with who I am, but I'm proud of who I am. I'm good. And I would have not explicitly added, but implicitly would have said, unlike those people. And those people were all the people I thought were not smart, not successful, were religious people, fundamentalists. I don't like those guys. And so that was, so the question then, when I began to understand what Christianity was saying, was it was challenging me to say, are you actually good? You think of yourself as good. That's true. But is it true? Are you actually good? And I believed in God in a vague sense, but what if God is like this? Then are you good in his eyes? And that's the question I was like, wait a minute. If Christianity is true, the answer is no, I'm not actually good. And then I began to see it. In fact, like I said with C.S. Lewis, the things I thought, I'm pretty good. Then he began to peel back the layers and saying, well, you say you're good, but let's look at your heart. Let's look at how you respond to other people, how you despise them secretly, not overtly, because that would make you bad, but in your heart of hearts, you really look down on people, don't you? So that began the process of saying, what if this thing is actually true? And I get through the book and how do I actually go from asking those questions to saying, no, this actually is true. But that was the journey was not, how can I find myself? But the journey was, am I good?
Okay. And in your book is a reasoned approach. It's very based on reason. And just speaking personally, reason never convinces me of anything. I'm very aesthetic. It's always been the aesthetic, the emotional, the phenomenological, I guess, is probably the best, because it's not necessarily, spirituality for me isn't necessarily a sensual thing, but it's some sort of very fine level of feeling or sensitivity or awareness, maybe even. So I'm wondering, from the perspective of the phenomenological or your heart, how did you know that Christianity is true? Not from your mind. This is very clean, clear explanation of a mental process of proving God. But I want to know the heart. How did you know in your heart that God's real, that Jesus is real, that Christianity is true?
Sure, great question. When you read the book, you'll find out, if you've read any other apologetics books, you'll see a lot of the similar things that people appeal to for how do we know God exists. I go through evidence that the Gospels, the Bible, New Testament is historically reliable. Here's charts. So it's very Enlightenment, modernist approach to well, look, here's the evidence that the Bible, the Gospels are historically reliable, and therefore we can trust what it says about Jesus. Okay, there's that stuff. But actually, the interesting part, Benjamin, is the last section of the book is something devoted to what I call the argument from the gospel, which actually I think really in a nice, it's something that I haven't seen before, but it actually unites those two halves, the rational and the phenomenological. And what I do is I say, and I said, Christianity is a story. It's a true story, but it's a story, a meta-narrative about reality and about your place in reality. So here's the argument. So I present this as it's a rational argument. It has premises and a conclusion, and yet it's an argument linked to the story being true. So here's the argument, basically. I say, let me give you an analogy first. I don't want to take too much time, but I say the analogy I give is imagine I'm playing basketball, pick up basketball, and I collapse on the court. And everyone runs over, and some people say, oh, you've just tripped. You're probably fine. Walk it off. Another guy says, no, I think he sprained his ankle. He just tripped, but he sprained his ankle, so I'll get an ace bandage. Another guy says, let me get him some Advil. So they're all having this, friendly conversation about how they can best help me. And then in the midst of that crowd, a woman rushes over, and she says, freeze, everybody freeze. Her eyes are all wide. She's like, I'm a doctor. I work at a hospital. I saw what happened. This man's life is in danger. Call an ambulance right now. He could die any second. Just get an ambulance here. And they look at her like lady, he tripped. You're hysterical. Like, you're freaking him out. Just leave him alone. But she turns to me and she looks at me and she says, I'm going to tell you two things. You can't feel your legs and you can't move. And the crowd is, again, just rolling their eyes. They're like, lady, you're hysterical. You're overreacting. But I turn to the crowd and I say, get me to a hospital right now. And they look at me. They're like, how can you believe this stranger? What's the reason? How can you rationally give credence to this crazy lady's story? You've never met her before. Well, and that's a good question, right? How can I know? Well, I know two things the crowd doesn't know. I can't feel my legs and I can't move. So I had immediate awareness of two truths that they didn't know. How could they know that? But she knew. And I think to myself, wait a minute. If everybody else says, oh, it's just sprained ankle, but she somehow uniquely had awareness of these two truths, what's the rational conclusion? She's probably who she said she was. She's probably a doctor. That's what gives her the authority and the experience and knowledge to correctly, uniquely diagnose me. Okay, tell that story for this. My argument is, if Christianity can uniquely identify two deep existential realities that you experience on a daily basis, and it's unique among all religions in saying those things are true, and you know they're true, the best explanation is it's true. It has that unique insight because it's because God, it's a revealed religion. God is saying this is how your heart works. Well, what are those two truths? And the two truths are, you're radically sinful. You're a radical moral failure. And you don't just need a little boost. You don't need a better government. You don't need, more money. You don't need a better job. You need a rescue. And then I argue, and then this is like 3 chapters of stuff I'm condensing, but I argue that we have every reason to not just believe, but know at a deep level that is exactly right. I make the case in the book. I can know that I'm a radical moral failure, that I need not just rules. Give me some rules and I'll follow them. No, you won't. That's the problem. I need a rescue from someone outside. And the point that I'm making is, how does the average person, you ask the average Christian, like, how do you become a Christian? They're not going to be like, well, I looked at the evidence or archaeology. I looked at the argument from fine tuning. They're not going to say that. What are they going to tell? Are they actually going to tell you, why are you a Christian, a genuine Christian, pious, and they would say, I needed, I know I'm a mess. I'm a mess. I knew I'm a mess, and I knew I needed rescue. I've tried all the self-help books. I've gone to the spiritual centers and the ashrams, and it didn't fix my life. I needed help, and I heard this message from some guy on the TV. He said, Jesus died for your sins. You can be forgiven and totally made new. And I've never heard that before. It's weird, right? I mean, it's a totally unique message. So I believed it, and it makes sense. They've just given you the argument I just made. Christianity correctly identified these two truths that they immediately recognize. Oh yeah, it totally makes sense in my life, and that makes sense to them. That it's reasonable for them to believe it's true. So I think that unites.
That doesn't mean that your legs have started coming back online, though.
So that's what I go into this in the last section of the book, but I talk about how what C.S. Lewis says. He's like, you look around, you're like, I know some Christians. They don't look, they still got problems. And he says a couple of things, but one of them is that, and this is the way he puts it in one of his Chronicles of Narnia books. He's like a kid named Eustace who was a real just jerk, but he meets Aslan and he basically becomes a Christian in the allegory of Narnia, and it says he wasn't healed yet, but the cure had begun. And so, and I do at one point, I actually say, yeah, it's classic objection, very fair objection. And I go through the actual statistics on measurable sociological metrics like how much do people give? Are they faithful to their spouse? And you can show sociologically that Christians do tend to behave better than atheists and than non-religious people. But my big point is like, be careful. I'm not saying we're better. I'm not saying that, because the entire point of Christianity is you're not better. You're not. And I do think if you're a Christian, you ought to see this change fundamentally in your heart, and that ought to be expressed in your behavior. But I don't want to give the impression at all that, you can tell Christianity is true because we're so nice. I mean, Mormons are nice. Mormons are super nice. Like, absolutely, some of the nice people I've met are Mormons, but I'm not a Mormon because I don't think it's true. But I am saying that I do think if a cure hasn't begun in your life, then I think you should ask, have I really trusted in Jesus? And so that's the answer is it's complicated. I'm not saying we're all or the best. That's why we should be Christian, because we're all awesome. I'm not saying that.
Mm-hmm. So what are you doing now? You're still studying? It seems like you've done so much studying in your life. You just keep on studying. You just move from one place to another, keep studying.
Well, you know what?
Teaching,
I'm actually the lightweight. I'm lightweight in my marriage. So my wife, I have a PhD in theoretical chemistry. My wife has, get this, a PhD, an independent MD, not an MD PhD. She independently got another MD after her PhD at Berkeley, and an MBA. So I am the lightweight in our house intellectually. But that said, so I can't. That's true though. I can't stop studying. So yeah, I finished my rough draft I guess in 2017, 2016, and providentially I met this guy named Pat Sawyer, who I've talked about, and he was actually getting a PhD in education and cultural studies at UNC Greensboro, and he's on faculty there now. And we met for the first time over apologetics and Christianity, and he goes to my church. But I kind of just to make small talk, what do you do? Tell me about your research. And he's talking about the stuff he's researching and studying. And I thought, this sounds familiar. I'm kind of seeing this in the culture a little bit. Mm-hmm. And so that's how we got connected. And so I began voraciously reading all of these. You can see them. I have them. What I'm currently researching right now is queer theory, because Pat and I are working on a book on critical theory. It'll probably be similar to Pluckrose and Lindsay's book, Cynical Theories, but written from a Christian perspective. So how should Christians in particular process all these ideas, critical race theory, queer theory, critical pedagogy, from a biblical perspective? And so that's what I'm working on right as we speak. I've finished. I have behind me, if you can zoom in on the titles, you'll see a lot of super woke stuff back there. So I've been trying to really interact with the primary sources and not rely on, well, so-and-so said this. I'm like, no, this is what the theorists themselves say.
And even then, exposed to this deep level of the critical theorists, are they starting to change your mind? Are they starting to make you see the world in terms of normativity that need to be smashed?
No, I do. What I do say, we say in the book, and we try to be fair. And actually, I think, even though, especially James Lindsay has gotten a reputation of a bit of a reactionary on Twitter, at least, but in their book, they really do make a very concerted effort to highlight where critical theorists get things right. They try to be very even-handed. And so we also are trying to highlight, well, when do critical theorists have a point about various things like race, class, and gender? And so we're planning on incorporating just statistics and real historical issues like the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, where critical race theorists have pointed out real problems with our country's history and even the present day approaches to race that I think are valid. And things with gender too. I think there are ways you can think about their critiques and say, well, that's actually fair. The one I always use with Christians is I say something like, is pink really for girls and is blue really for boys? And they kind of think for a second. They're like, oh, that's true. That's not really like an objective God-ordained norm. It's like we've just decided as a culture that in our culture, blue is for boys and pink is for girls. But, 500 years ago, the men were wearing these fluffy pink shirts because pink is like red and red's the color of blood and war. But so in our culture, so those meanings we give to things like colors are constructed. And so we shouldn't retreat to this weird position where we're like, no, blue is definitely for boys. And we say, oh, no, that is a cultural thing. Although we also add, say, as a Christian, I think gender's God ordained. And because of that, even though the color blue is not a masculine, and yet I choose, it's just a coincidence. I'm wearing this shirt because it's a pun. I thought I'd wear it for you. It says, I found this humorous. So I wore this for you. I need like that. But the point is, the reason that we don't flout gender stereotypes, which are cultural constructs for in large part, is because we want to say, I delight in my gender. It's a good thing. I like being a man. My wife likes being a woman. It's a good thing. We don't reject it. We don't try to destabilize it. But not because it's somehow objectively blue is masculine, but because in our culture we want to show that this is a thing that we embrace as Christians. Anyway, so we try to again highlight where critical theorists say true things, and we should not ignore that.
And when do you guys expect to be finished with that?
That's the question. Yeah, I've been cranking it out like 1,000 words a day, but
Oh, wow.
When I go all in. But I'm a homeschooling dad, so I also have the school year starting. So we're gonna slow it down, I bet, soon. But hopefully hopefully within a year or two.
Okay. And do you guys do anything else, like a regular podcast, or do you do that?
And I just mooch off people like you.
Yeah, okay.
Willing to have me on their
you're a guest, not a platform.
I'm a guest, not a host. I mean, we occasionally will go. I speak at conferences occasionally and do lots of. I can't travel very much because of my family responsibilities, but I do podcasts and things. And Pat does too. Pat speaks at professional conferences. I mean, he's a academician. And he edits a journal and stuff. So yeah, he speaks and gives talks and things. But we don't do like a regular podcast.
Okay. I mean, I asked that is in order for the audience to find like a regular or centralized collection of your work. Is there a? Oh.
Yeah, so that's my website. Just you Google Neil Shenvi. So I'm like I'm half Indian. Yeah, so I'm like the only Neil Shenvi in the world right now. So Google Neil Shenvi, you'll find my website.
You didn't name your kid that to up the odds?
What's that? No, well, the funny thing is, our kids, the Indian tradition is that you give your firstborn son your name as a middle name. So my son has Neil as his middle name, but he has a very American name, but he is also so all of my kids with this super Indian last name and like very American first names are gonna be totally like, this is weird. But yeah, if you Google Neil Shenvi, you'll find my website, and it's to be fair, it's quite big. So I think I've reviewed 60 to 70 different books, mainly on critical social theories of various kinds, and you'll find, and they're usually very heavy on quotes, and so you're not getting my opinion. Hopefully, you're getting like, well, this is what they say. So there's if you look on YouTube, I've given interviews and talks to various people on various topics.
Yeah. Well, Neil, it was fabulous to speak with you. We were going to speak a long time ago, but now we finally did. So thank you very much for joining me. And
yeah, this has been great, Ben. Thanks so much. Is it Ben or Benjamin?
I prefer Benjamin, but if we're ordering Starbucks, we can tell the barista it's just Ben, so they don't have to type the whole thing out. So your book, Why Believe, can be found on Amazon. What's your preferred way for people to buy it?
There's Amazon. I mean, the Crossway publisher is Crossway. You can go to crossway.com and just Google it, or just Google Why Believe Neil Shenvi. You'll find links to it.
Excellent. Well, I will link all that in the description.
Great. Thanks so much, Benjamin.
Thank you.